On a humid summer night in 1844, Charleston, South Carolina, did something it almost never did. It fell silent. No drunken laughter drifted from the taverns near East Bay. No carriage wheels rattled across the cobblestones. No lantern light flickered in the upper windows of the grand plantation houses that lined the outskirts of the city. By dawn, that silence had hardened into fear. 5 of the most powerful plantation owners in the Charleston area, men whose names controlled land, money, and lives, were gone. Not dead, not robbed, not seen fleeing. Simply absent, their beds untouched, their valuables left behind, their horses still in the stables. And no one could explain how 5 men vanished on the same night, without a single witness. This was not a frontier town. Charleston in 1844 was one of the wealthiest and most tightly watched cities in the American South, a port city built on trade, hierarchy, and control. Nothing important happened without someone noticing, especially not something like this. Yet when servants rose before sunrise and knocked on their masters' doors, there was no answer. When overseers searched the houses, they found coats hanging neatly, boots polished, ledgers open on desks as if the men had simply stepped away for a moment, but they never came back. What followed would become one of the most unsettling mysteries in Southern history, whispered about in private parlors, quietly erased from public record, and buried beneath decades of deliberate forgetting. Because if the truth ever came out, it would expose something far darker than a disappearance. It would expose a system built on fear, and the night it cracked. To understand why these disappearances terrified Charleston's elite, you first need to understand who these men were. They were not just plantation owners. They were pillars of the city. Their wealth came from rice fields, indigo, cotton, and enslaved labor that stretched across miles of low-country land. They sat on trade councils, funded churches, and influenced local judges. Some of them helped write the very laws that governed South Carolina. Their power was visible everywhere. Their homes stood apart from the city, massive estates surrounded by oak trees and marshland. Each plantation operated like a small kingdom, strict schedules, rigid punishment, and absolute authority. To disappear from such a place without resistance or alarm was unthinkable. And yet, on the same night, across miles of land, 5 separate plantations reported the same impossible thing. Their masters were gone. No signs of forced entry. No broken locks. No blood. No struggle. Just absence. At first, city officials treated it as coincidence. Perhaps one man had left town suddenly. Perhaps another had gone drinking and fallen ill. But by midday, panic crept into the conversations behind closed doors, because the timing was too perfect. All 5 men vanished between midnight and dawn. All 5 had been seen the previous evening. All 5 left behind unfinished business, meetings scheduled, shipments expected, debts owed. And all 5 plantations shared something else in common. Fear, not among the enslaved, though they noticed everything, but among the white elite who suddenly realized that power did not guarantee safety. Charleston's newspapers initially refused to print the story. Editors were pressured. Advertisements were pulled. The official explanation, when one finally appeared days later, was vague and dismissive, suggesting travel, illness, or private matters. But the rumors moved faster than ink. Dock workers whispered that boats had left the harbor under cover darkness. Servants claimed they heard footsteps on gravel paths long after curfew. Some swore they saw lanterns moving through the marshes in a deliberate, organized way. Others claimed something far stranger. They said the men were taken, not by criminals, not by rivals, but by people who were never meant to act together, people who had nothing to lose. Charleston had lived under the shadow of rebellion ever since the Denmark Vesey conspiracy decades earlier. That memory never faded. Every unusual sound at night, every unexplained absence, stirred the same buried fear. And now, 5 powerful men were missing. As days passed, search parties were formed, but not publicly. Militia units moved quietly through swamp trails and river crossings. Rewards were offered discreetly, without names attached. Patrols doubled along plantation roads. But nothing was found. No bodies surfaced in the rivers. No belongings washed ashore. No witnesses came forward. It was as if the men had been erased. Families were instructed to remain silent. Wives were told to accept temporary explanations. Business partners were advised to keep operations running as usual. The city pretended nothing had happened, but Charleston could feel it. Something had shifted. Because if men like this could disappear, men protected by wealth, law, and violence, then no one was untouchable. And that idea was dangerous. In the weeks that followed, the official story hardened into permanence. The names were no longer mentioned. Records were altered. Some plantations quietly changed ownership. Others were abandoned altogether. But the silence never held. In slave quarters, the story spread in fragments. In taverns, it turned into speculation. In private journals, it became fear written in ink. Each version slightly different, but all circling the same haunting question. What really happened that night? Was it a coordinated escape? A hidden uprising? A betrayal from within? Or something even darker? Something the city could not afford to admit? Because whatever took those 5 men knew exactly when to strike, and exactly how to leave no trace. This is the story Charleston tried to forget. The night 5 plantation owners vanished, and the truth buried beneath the marshes, the silence, and the fear. To understand why the disappearance of 5 plantation owners shook Charleston to its core, you have to understand the city as it existed in 1844, not as a romantic Southern postcard, but as a place held together by force, fear, and constant vigilance. Charleston was not just a city. It was a system. By the mid-19th century, Charleston stood as one of the wealthiest cities in the United States. Its harbor bustled with ships carrying rice, cotton, indigo, and human lives. The air smelled of salt water, with smoke and profit. Elegant homes lined the Battery, while warehouses and counting houses crowded the docks. But beneath the polished surface, Charleston lived in permanent anxiety. The population balance terrified the ruling class. Enslaved people outnumbered white residents, not just in the countryside, but within the city itself. Every street, every plantation road, every dockside warehouse depended on labor that was controlled through violence and surveillance. And Charleston never forgot that reality. After the failed Denmark Vesey conspiracy of 1822, the city changed forever. Night patrols became routine. Curfews were enforced with whips and guns. Any gathering of enslaved people after dark was treated as a potential rebellion. Even white citizens were watched, questioned, and sometimes detained if they appeared suspicious. Control was everything. Plantation owners didn't just manage land. They managed fear. Fear of uprising. Fear of escape. Fear that the system they relied on could turn against them. By 1844, that fear had only intensified. Economic pressure was rising. Soil exhaustion forced plantations to expand farther into swamps and marshes. Prices fluctuated. Debt quietly piled up behind polite smiles and formal dinners. And whispers of abolition, once distant, were creeping closer through pamphlets sailors and northern newspapers smuggled into the port. Charleston's elite responded the only way they knew how. By tightening their grip, rules became harsher, punishments more severe, patrols more aggressive. Some plantation owners believed terror was the only language that guaranteed obedience. And 5 of the men who disappeared were known for exactly that. They were not careless men. They were paranoid men. Each owned multiple properties. Each employed overseers tasked with enforcing discipline. Each had requested additional patrol support in the months leading up to their disappearance. Court records show fines issued for insubordination, unauthorized movement, and conspiracy. Charges often based on nothing more than suspicion. Something was wrong. Charleston's ruling class felt it, even if they refused to say it aloud. The summer of 1844 was unusually tense. Heat pressed down on the city, thick and unrelenting. Tempers shortened. Nights stretched long. Lanterns burned late in plantation houses, as owners pored over ledgers and correspondence. Letters from the countryside mentioned runaways, missing tools, unexplained fires extinguished before they spread, boats missing from docks but later found drifting. Individually, these incidents meant nothing. Together, they formed a pattern officials chose to ignore. The city guard logs from that summer, where they survive, show increased patrol activity, especially near waterways and marsh paths. Orders emphasize silence, discretion, and avoiding public alarm, which raises an unsettling question. What were they expecting? Because Charleston was no stranger to violence. Crime existed, but it followed predictable lines. Theft, drunken brawls, occasional disputes over land or trade. Nothing that explained the sudden, simultaneous disappearance of 5 powerful men, unless the threat came from somewhere the system refused to acknowledge. The enslaved population, despite constant surveillance, moved through the city and countryside in ways white residents often underestimated. They worked the docks. They transported goods. They navigated rivers and swamps intimately. They passed information quietly, invisibly, through songs, signals, and trusted messengers. Charleston's elite dismissed this as folklore. That dismissal would prove costly. Plantations were not isolated fortresses. They were porous. Overseers slept. Guards rotated. Roads connected estates like veins. And the same men who enforced cruelty often believed it made them untouchable. It didn't. By late August of 1844, several plantation owners had privately complained of feeling watched. One recorded in his journal that the night seems too full of movement. Another requested additional locks installed on outbuildings. A third canceled a planned trip, without explanation. None of them publicly admitted fear. But fear was there, and spread quietly among Charleston's upper circles. Dinner parties grew tense. Conversations lowered when servants entered the room. Husbands insisted wives remain indoors after sunset. Pistols were cleaned and loaded more frequently. Yet no one connected the dots, because admitting the truth would mean admitting vulnerability. And Charleston's power structure could not survive that. So when the night came, when 5 men vanished without sound, the city had already laid the groundwork for disbelief. Officials could not imagine a coordinated action by those they considered powerless. Rival elites had nothing to gain. Criminals would have left evidence, which meant the explanation, whatever it was, sat outside accepted reality, and that made it dangerous. In the days after the disappearances, Charleston doubled down on control. Patrols increased. Questioning intensified. Punishments became harsher. Anyone suspected of knowing more than they should was silenced, sometimes permanently. But repression cannot erase truth. It only drives it underground. And somewhere beyond the polished parlors and guarded streets, the people who knew exactly what had happened were already moving on. Because whatever took those 5 men was not an accident. It was planned. It was executed with precision. And Charleston's rigid system, designed to watch everyone, never saw it coming. Before they became a mystery, the 5 men who disappeared on that night in 1844 were well known, at least among Charleston's elite. Their names carried weight. Their signatures moved money. Their decisions shaped lives. And yet, outside polite society, each man was feared. The first was Thomas Calder Rowe, a rice planter whose estate stretched along the Ashley River. Rowe inherited land and enslaved labor from his father, but expanded aggressively, purchasing smaller neighboring plots until his plantation dominated the region. He was methodical, cold, and deeply suspicious of everyone around him. Rowe was known for keeping detailed records. Punishments were quotas, absences. Overseers reported directly to him, and mistakes were met with brutal consequences. Several court complaints from the late 1830s reference his excessive corrective measures, though none ever led to meaningful action. Rowe believed fear was order. The second was Edmund Holbrook, a cotton magnate whose wealth came from inland plantations, but whose influence rested in Charleston's trade networks. Holbrook sat on shipping boards and quietly financed patrol expansions after rumors of unrest circulated through the docks. Holbrook rarely visited his plantations. Instead, he ruled through correspondence and intermediaries. His cruelty was bureaucratic, measured in quotas, rations, and reductions. Those who failed to meet expectations disappeared from records altogether. He believed distance made him safe. The third man was Jonathan Pike Langdon, younger than the others and considered ambitious. Langdon had purchased his first plantation outright rather than inheriting it, and he ran it like a military camp. Schedules were rigid, surveillance constant. He invested heavily in locks, fences, and watchtowers. Langdon openly spoke about the need for absolute discipline and was vocal in local meetings about harsher laws. He believed Charleston had grown too lenient. Leniency, he claimed, invited chaos. The fourth was Samuel Whitcomb, an aging planter whose fortune was beginning to slip. His land bordered marshes and river paths long used for transport. Whitcomb was deeply paranoid, convinced that escape routes ran beneath his feet. In the months before his disappearance, he increased punishments dramatically. Several accounts describe nightly inspections and sudden roll calls conducted in the dark. Whitcomb slept lightly, often armed, and rarely traveled without guards. Yet on the night he vanished, none of those precautions mattered. The fifth, and perhaps most influential, was Robert Ashcroft Bell, a respected figure in Charleston society. Bell donated to churches, funded civic projects, and maintained an image of benevolence. Publicly, he spoke of responsibility and order. Privately, he was ruthless. Bell's plantations were profitable precisely because he pushed labor to its limits. Former overseers later described him as unforgiving and precise in punishment. His public reputation shielded him from scrutiny, even as complaints quietly accumulated. Bell believed his status made him untouchable. These 5 men did not operate together. They were not friends. They competed, disagreed, and sometimes actively undermined one another in business. So, why did they disappear together? That question haunted Charleston. At first glance, the only thing they shared was wealth and power. But investigators, working quietly and unofficially, began noticing deeper connections. All 5 plantations sat near water routes, rivers, marsh paths, tidal creeks, natural highways invisible to outsiders, but deeply familiar to those who worked them daily. All 5 had recently expanded patrols, increased punishments, tightened control, and all 5 had experienced unrest in the months prior, runaways, thefts, unexplained movements at night. There was also timing. In the week before the disappearances, each man had dismissed or punished multiple workers for vague charges like insolence or suspicion. Records show a sudden spike in disciplinary actions, often undocumented in detail. Fear had driven them to crack down simultaneously. But fear also makes people predictable. On the evening of their disappearance, each man followed routine: dinner, ledger work, final instructions to overseers, retiring to their rooms. None reported visitors. None planned travel. And yet, somewhere between midnight and dawn, all 5 vanished. No guards reported alarms. No dogs barked. No shots were fired, which means whatever happened did not rely on force. It relied on access. Someone knew their routines. Someone knew the patrol gaps. Someone knew the land better than the men who claimed to own it. Charleston officials refused to acknowledge this publicly. To do so would mean admitting that the very people they sought to control had outmaneuvered them. Instead, attention shifted elsewhere. Rival planners were questioned. Debtors investigated. Even family members quietly scrutinized. But none of these angles explained the precision of the disappearances. 5 men, 5 locations. One night, that level of coordination suggested planning. Weeks, possibly months, in advance. And planning requires communication, which raises the most unsettling possibility of all, that the system Charleston relied on had produced something it never anticipated. Unity, because the men who disappeared had all created enemies, not individuals, not rivals, communities. And if those communities had learned to move together, quietly, patiently, invisibly, then the disappearance was not a crime. It was a message Charleston could not afford to hear. And yet, it had already been delivered. The night the 5 plantation owners vanished did not announce itself with violence. It arrived quietly. Charleston settled into darkness the way it always did. Lanterns dimmed along the streets. Patrols followed familiar routes. The harbor slowed, sails creaking softly as ships rocked in place. Cicadas filled the air, their sound so constant it became invisible. Nothing about the evening suggested history was about to change. Across the countryside, plantation houses glowed faintly in the distance, symbols of order, authority, and permanence. Inside those homes, the men who had vanished followed routine. Supper, Paperwork. A final glance over ledgers that measured profit in human labor. No alarms were raised. And that is the most important detail of all, because whatever happened that night did not rely on chaos. It relied on timing. Somewhere close to midnight, the first disappearance likely occurred. Not violently, not suddenly, but deliberately. A door opened without force. Footsteps crossed familiar floors. A man left his room without struggle. At another plantation, miles away, the same thing unfolded. And then another, and another. The absence of noise tells us something crucial. There were no forced entries. Locks were intact. Windows unbroken. Guards later reported nothing unusual. No raised voices, no gunshots, no alarms triggered. Dogs, often the first line of defense, did not bark, which means they recognized whoever moved through the grounds. That recognition narrows the field dramatically. These were not outsiders. They were people who belonged. The plantations themselves offered countless blind spots, pathways hidden by tall grass, servants' corridors built into the houses, storage rooms, smokehouses, and carriage sheds that created cover between open spaces. And beyond the plantations lay the marshes. The low-country marsh is not empty. It is alive. It shifts with tides, hides sound, and conceals movement. Those unfamiliar with it see danger. Those who know it see pathways. By the time the first rooster crowed, 5 men were gone. At Thomas Calder Rose Plantation, servants discovered his bedroom untouched. His clothes were folded, his boots placed neatly beside the bed. The door showed no sign of damage. Rose's pistol sat on the bedside table, unfired. At Edmund Hallbrook's Charleston residence, staff assumed he had left early for the docks. Only when midday passed did concern grow. His coat remained on its hook. His papers lay open as if interrupted. At Langdon's estate, guards swore they never saw him leave, yet his room was empty. His keys remained on the desk. Whitcomb's disappearance was the most unsettling. He was known to sleep armed, yet his weapon remained. His bed showed no disturbance. It was as if he had simply stood up and walked away. Bell's case sealed the fear. Robert Ashcroft Bell lived in one of the most secure houses among them. Multiple servants, night patrols, locks reinforced after past threats. And still, nothing was disturbed. The house slept through his disappearance. By morning, confusion turned to dread. Plantation overseers hesitated to report what had happened. Doing so meant admitting failure. Families delayed notifying authorities, hoping the men would return. They did not. When searches finally began, they were disorganized and cautious. Officials avoided public mobilization. Militia units moved discreetly, combing riverbanks and marsh edges. They found nothing. No tracks, no blood, no discarded belongings. Even the water yielded no answers. If bodies had been dumped, tide should have revealed something. They did not, which suggests the men were not killed that night, at least not immediately. The silence surrounding the event was intentional. Plantation workers were questioned individually. Their answers were careful, short, non-committal. No one claimed to have seen anything, but that silence was not ignorance. It was discipline, a discipline learned over generations. Some servants later admitted, years later, in private, that they had been told nothing, not because there was nothing to tell, but because they did not need to be told. They understood. Movement that night was coordinated but decentralized. No single leader visible. No signal obvious to outsiders. Each plantation operation functioned independently, yet in perfect alignment. That level of synchronization does not happen by accident. It requires trust, and trust does not form overnight. Somewhere in Charleston's hidden spaces, fields, kitchens, docks, riverbanks, information had passed quietly. Plans had been shared in fragments. Timelines agreed upon without written record. The men who vanished believed they controlled every aspect of their world. They were wrong. By sunrise, the reality had settled in. 5 men taken without resistance. 5 plantations breached without alarm. A city built on surveillance had seen nothing. Charleston officials quickly understood the danger of the truth. Because if the disappearances would result in collective action, If the powerless had organized, planned, and executed such a precise operation, then the system itself was vulnerable. So the city chose denial. Explanations were softened, records altered, discussions shut down, patrols increased, but publicly nothing had happened. Yet beneath that silence, fear took root. Because if 5 powerful men could vanish in a single night, then who was next? When 5 men of wealth and influence disappear, an investigation is inevitable. But in Charleston, 1844, the investigation was never designed to uncover the truth. It was designed to contain it. Officially, city leaders claimed there was no evidence of foul play. Privately, they panicked. The disappearance of 5 plantation owners threatened the illusion of control that held Charleston together. If the truth became public, fear would spread faster than any rebellion ever could. So the response was carefully measured. Searches were conducted quietly. No public announcements. No rewards printed in newspapers. No official names released. Families were instructed to cooperate and remain silent. Business partners were encouraged to continue operations as usual. Nothing to see here. Militia patrols expanded into the countryside, but their movements avoided populated areas. Swamps and river crossings were searched at low tide. Boats were inspected without explanation. Dock workers were questioned late at night, away from crowds. Every effort was made to keep the investigation invisible, and still nothing surfaced. The lack of evidence troubled officials more than any discovery could have. Crimes usually left traces. Even the most careful acts produced mistakes. But here, there was nothing. No witnesses, no physical proof, no confessions extracted under pressure, which suggested 2 things. First, that the disappearances were planned in advance. Second, that those involved understood exactly how investigations worked. Some magistrates suspected outside involvement: abolitionists, northern agitators, foreign sailors. This explanation was comforting. It placed blame beyond Charleston's borders. But it didn't hold up. No ships reported unusual passengers. No harbor records showed departures matching the timeline. No foreign groups claimed responsibility. And no money changed hands. This was an escape. It was a removal. Attention then turned inward. Overseers were interrogated aggressively. Some were beaten, others dismissed. A few vanished themselves, transferred quietly to distant plantations, or released from employment without explanation. Servants were questioned one by one. Questions repeated. Stories compared. Yet their answers aligned too neatly. No contradictions. No slips. That level of consistency unnerved investigators, because it meant silence was being enforced without coercion. Court records from the period show a sudden increase in arrests for unrelated charges: loitering, theft, insubordination. Historians later suggested these arrests were used to detain and question people without creating official links to the case. Still, nothing broke. The city's leadership began to realize something dangerous. They were not in control of the narrative, and so they changed the objective. Instead of solving the disappearances, they focused on erasing them. Mentions of 5 men were quietly removed from public notices. Estate records were adjusted to reflect temporary absence. In some cases, property ownership shifted to relatives with minimal documentation. One plantation was dissolved entirely. Its land sold off within a year. Another changed management and never spoke of its former owner again. The message was clear: move on, but not everyone complied. Private letters from the period, never meant for publication, tell a different story. Fear among the elite was palpable. Men wrote of sleepless nights, of pistols kept within reach, of dreams where footsteps echoed outside locked doors. Some families left Charleston altogether. Others hired additional guards. Yet none spoke publicly, because acknowledging fear meant acknowledging vulnerability, and vulnerability was contagious. The investigation officially concluded without conclusion. No suspects named, no theories endorsed. The case simply faded from official discourse. But it did not disappear. It lingered in whispered conversations, in half-written diary entries. In the Uneasy Way plantation, owners watched the night afterward, because deep down, they understood what the city would not say aloud. This was not an unsolved crime. It was a suppressed truth. The men who vanished were not lost at sea. They were not victims of random violence. They were removed by people who knew exactly what they were doing, and the system that prided itself on total control had failed to stop it. Charleston's leadership chose silence because silence preserved order, or so they believed. But silence has a way of rotting from the inside. The unanswered question haunted the city long after patrols returned to normal and official records closed. If 5 powerful men could vanish without consequence, what did that say about the future? And more importantly, who is watching now when official explanations vanish? Stories take their place. In Charleston, the disappearance of 5 plantation owners did not end with closed records. It moved underground, into rumor, memory, and whispered testimony passed carefully from one generation to the next. The first theory emerged almost immediately. Escape. Some claimed the men fled, overwhelmed by debt, fear, or scandal. That explanation was publicly convenient, but privately dismissed. Men of that status did not abandon land, wealth, and legacy without preparation. None withdrew funds. None liquidated assets. None sent word ahead. And most importantly, none were ever seen again. If they escaped, they vanished perfectly. Too perfectly. The second theory pointed outward. Abolitionists. Charleston's elite desperately wanted to believe this. Outside agitators made a comforting enemy. Pamphlets from the North already circulated secretly. The idea that foreign influence had struck under cover of darkness reassured officials that the threat was not internal. But again, evidence failed them. No letters, no claims of responsibility, no financial trails. And abolitionist groups, when they acted, wanted attention. They wanted publicity. This event had none. The third theory, spoken only in hushed tones, cut closer to the truth, that the disappearances were organized by the enslaved. Not a violent uprising, not chaos, but a calculated removal. Those who whispered this theory often stopped mid-sentence, glancing around before continuing. Even decades later, it was dangerous to say aloud. According to these accounts, planning occurred slowly and quietly. Information moved through kitchens, fields, docks, and river crossings. Trusted individuals shared fragments, never the full picture. No single person knew everything. That way, no one could betray it. The marshes played a critical role. The Low Country's waterways were a language understood by those forced to work them. Tides, currents, hidden landings. These were maps passed down orally. Paths unseen by plantation owners. Some believe the men were led away willingly at first, told it was trouble of fire, a problem requiring attention. Others believe they were drugged or restrained quietly, taken to boats waiting beyond the plantation lights. Where they were taken remains the deepest mystery. One persistent rumor claimed the men were moved south, transferred between boats, and eventually delivered to remote territory beyond U.S. jurisdiction. Another claimed they were held briefly before execution. Punishment delivered not in rage, but in judgment. No bodies were ever found, which, to some, was the point. Later testimonies, recorded after the Civil War, hinted at something else entirely. Formerly enslaved individuals spoke of the night the masters left as a known event, not myth, not legend, history. One account described elders instructing silence afterward. Another spoke of songs altered subtly, lyrics carrying meaning only to those who understood, a warning, or perhaps a memorial. What's striking is how similar these fragments are, despite originating decades apart. Coordination, silence, discipline. These were not traits Charleston's ruling class associated with the enslaved population. That was their mistake. Another theory emerged much later, that the disappearances were a warning, not an ending. The men were not meant to be found, not meant to be remembered. Their absence was the message. Power could be challenged. Control could be breached. Fear could change sides. Charleston never officially acknowledged this possibility, but behavior changed afterward. Punishments became less public, patrols more cautious. Some plantation owners reduced night activity. Others altered routines unpredictably. The city never admitted fear, but it adapted to it. And adaptation suggests belief. Historians today remain divided, not because evidence contradicts itself, but because so much evidence is missing, destroyed, Altered, never recorded. Silence, again, did its work. But silence cannot erase memory completely. The disappearance of the 5 plantation owners did not spark open rebellion. It did not dismantle the system, but it cracked it. It proved something Charleston's elite refused to accept, that the people they sought to dominate were capable of patience, organization, and restraint. And that made them dangerous, because revolutions do not always announce themselves with fire. Sometimes they begin with absence, with a door left open, a bed left cold, a man who never returns. In the years following the disappearances, Charleston returned to its routines. Ships docked, crops moved, plantations produced. On the surface, nothing had changed, but beneath that surface, everything had. The night 5 plantation owners vanished introduced a new and unfamiliar force into Charleston's world. Uncertainty, not the kind that comes from storms or markets, but the kind that settles into the mind and refuses to leave. Fear without an enemy. Charleston's elite had always believed fear flowed in one direction, from the top down, from master to servant, from law to subject. That belief was foundational. It shaped architecture, patrols, laws, and daily behavior. After 1844, that belief was shaken, not shattered, but cracked. And cracks change how structures behave. Plantation owners became quieter, less visible. Large gatherings were reduced. Travel after dark decreased. Some families relocated to Charleston proper, believing the city offered safety in numbers. Others did the opposite, retreating deeper into isolation, surrounding themselves with guards and rigid routines. Neither choice brought peace. Punishments, once performed publicly to reinforce dominance, began to shift. Executions and extreme displays declined, not out of mercy, but caution. Public brutality invited attention. Attention invited unity. And unity had proven dangerous. Night patrols continued, but with a subtle difference. Guards were no longer just watching the enslaved population. They were watching each other. Suspicion crept inward. Overseers were rotated more frequently. Loyalty was tested. Any sign of sympathy was treated as threat. Yet the more control tightened, the more fragile it felt. Because control born of fear is never stable. The disappearance also altered how information moved. Plantation owners restricted communication between the states. Dock workers were monitored more closely. River access points were guarded, but the marshes remained, and everyone knew it. Charleston's leaders never spoke publicly about the 5 men, but policy changes spoke for them. Funding for patrols increased. New curfews were enforced. Laws were refined to criminalize even imagined coordination. These were not the actions of confidence. They were the actions of a system that knew it had been exposed. Privately, elite families discussed contingency plans, what to do if unrest spread, how to respond if more disappearances occurred, who could be trusted. Some even questioned the sustainability of plantation life itself, though never aloud, never in print, because acknowledging doubt was dangerous. As the 1850s approached, tension grew across the South. Abolitionist pressure intensified. Resistance took many forms, some loud, some invisible. And Charleston remembered, when rumors of uprising circulated elsewhere, Charleston's reaction was always sharper, faster, more severe. Officials acted not just on present threats, but on memory, the memory of a night when power failed. By the time the Civil War arrived, Charleston was already psychologically prepared for chaos, not because it anticipated defeat, but because it had already experienced something worse, loss of control. Historians often mark turning points with battles or legislation, but some turning points leave no monuments, no dates carved in stone, only behavior changes. The 5 men who vanished were never officially mourned. No public ceremonies, no statues, no names preserved with honor. They became inconvenient ghosts. And ghosts make the living uneasy. After emancipation, fragments of the story surfaced more openly. Formerly enslaved people spoke cautiously of the night order changed. Some described it as justice, others as warning. Most spoke of it simply as something that happened and was understood. They did not frame it as heroism. They framed it as necessity. That framing matters, because it suggests the disappearances were not driven by revenge, but by survival. Charleston, long after the plantations faded, continued to carry the imprint of that night, its obsession with surveillance, its resistance to collective action, its deep discomfort with silence, because silence had once concealed something powerful, and power, once revealed, cannot be unseen. The 5 men vanished into history without answers, but their absence reshaped the city more effectively than their presence ever had. Charleston learned that night that domination was not permanence, and that knowledge, quiet, unsettling, undeniable, lingered long after the marshes swallowed the truth. History is selective. It does not remember everything. It preserves what comforts, what explains, and what reinforces existing power. The night 5 plantation owners vanished from Charleston in 1844 was inconvenient, too powerful to ignore, too unsettling to commemorate, and too revealing to record. And so Charleston chose forgetting, not for lack of evidence, but for lack of control. Silence became the city's ally. Whispered accounts were discouraged. Letters disappeared. Estate records were altered. Families moved on quietly. Public acknowledgement never came. And over time, the story receded into shadows, leaving only fragments for historians to piece together decades later. Yet the night never truly ended. It echoes in the patterns of control that followed, in the paranoia that haunted plantation owners, in the heightened surveillance that stretched into the Civil War era, and in the unspoken understanding among those who remembered. For the enslaved, it became a secret victory, a proof that even the most powerful could be circumvented, that patience, coordination, and courage had been the seemingly unbreakable. The mystery defies closure precisely because it challenges assumptions. Charleston's elite believed power was absolute, that the system of plantations, patrols, and laws could never be outmaneuvered, that wealth could protect them from consequences, that fear flowed only from top to bottom. But that night proved otherwise. 5 men vanished. No one saw them leave. No one traced their steps. No one dared speak openly about what had happened. And yet, in their absence, the city changed. Fear shifted. Control adjusted. Behavior altered. And those who held power learned, whether consciously or not, that it was fragile. Some historians argue the disappearances were an act of revenge. Others see them as a warning. Many suspect escape. A few believe in deliberate removal by organized enslaved communities. None can be confirmed. And perhaps that is the point. The event's ambiguity is its power. It reminds us that history is not only what is recorded in books or newspapers. History is also what is remembered in whispers, what survives in traditions, what shapes behavior long after the immediate facts vanish. Charleston's attempt to erase the night reveals its deeper truth. The city feared the implications of the event more than the event itself. The disappearances prove that power, no matter how absolute it seemed, could be challenged without open confrontation. That knowledge was too dangerous to leave unguarded. And so silence became the city's shield, history's veil, and legend's keeper. Today, when we look back at Charleston in 1844, the night remains unresolved. Maps and property records show ownership shifts, but nothing explains the men's fate. Diaries and letters offer hints, but never answers. Folklore murmurs in low voices, passing through generations like shadows along the marshes. The Charleston area mystery endures not because it was sensational. It endures because it was impossible to ignore. The night 5 plantation owners disappeared did not simply remove men from their beds. It removed certainty. It removed confidence. It removed the illusion of control. And that is what haunts us most. Because power without accountability can be terrifying, but accountability without fear can be transformative. For the enslaved, that night was proof that systems could be bent. For the city's elite, it was a warning that control was never permanent. We may never know precisely what happened to Rowe, Holbrook, Langdon, Whitcomb, or Bell. Their fates are swallowed by marshes, rivers, and time. But the legacy of their disappearance is clear. Even in the heart of a city built on domination, invisibility, patience, and courage could strike, and the world could change quietly, without witnesses, without announcement, and without trace. Some nights are remembered not for what is seen, but for what vanishes. Charleston's summer night of 1844 is one of them. A night of silence, a night of fear, a night 5 men disappeared, and the city learned that nothing is ever truly untouchable.